So this is the next, and I'm anticipating this to be the last of my series on the founding fathers, the founding documents, the constitutions, the inscriptions, the writings, the words of the really the founding of our nation. And in the previous lessons, I've talked a lot about the founding fathers and their intentions and so forth. But in this particular lesson and video, I want to speak specifically to at least a handful of those founding fathers. Now, today, there are many who are skeptical about the true intentions of the founding fathers. There are some that question whether in fact the notion that they were actually Christians is true. Some say that most of them were actually deists and were not Christians, and perhaps that their original intention was to establish a secular nation. Um, in this particular lesson, I want to look at their words directly, others describing them, and let you decide whether it appears from directly from their own mouths, if you will, that they were deists, or whether in fact they were what I would call professing Christians. So let's take a look at a few at least. I obviously don't have time to do like all the signers of the Declaration and all that, but certainly the major figures, at least some of the major figures, want to take a look at. First, let's talk about deism. And as I said, there are many of our founding fathers that find themselves, at least in the view of modern day scholars, they accuse them of being deists. Well, what is a deist? I've talked about it a little bit in some of the previous lessons in this series, but here is a definition from Webster's dictionary from 1854, so from way back. One who believes in the existence of God but denies revealed religion, one who professes no form of religion but follows the light of nature and reason as his only guides in doctrine and practice. Some would describe them, and of course, in this definition, as you can see, describe them as, quote, a free thinker. Well, let's take a look and see whether that sort of definition, and just to go a step further, one way to think about it would be that they may believe in a higher power, but not necessarily one that was personal. They would not believe that this higher power involves himself in the affairs of men and women. It, the situation's been described as like a watchmaker who makes the watch, winds it up, sets it down, and just lets it run, and doesn't really engage or involve at all. So that's sort of a way of thinking of what a deist would be. So let's look first at George Washington. Obviously, George Washington is labeled and considered the father of our country. Religious wise, he was an Episcopalian, so obviously he was a follower of a Protestant Christian denomination. Now, the interesting thing is that there are actually some scholars who accuse him or label him as a deist, and yet he repeatedly professed his Christianity. We're going to look at some of his words in a minute. Obviously, he was called and described as a virtuous, humble man by those who knew him. But let's take a look. Rather than listen to how others describe him, let's take a look at Washington in his own words. Quote, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ." Right there, that quote would not come from the mouth or the pen of a deist. A deist is not a Christian. A deist would not be a disciple of Jesus Christ. A deist would not point one to a religion of Jesus Christ. Here's another one. Direct me to the true object, Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. O Lord, all the people of this land, from the highest to the lowest, particularly those whom thou hast appointed to rule over us in church and state. This is from one of his prayers. This is, again, not something that you would hear. You would not hear a deist describing Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, obviously, which comes right from the pages of the New Testament. On the tomb, on the rear wall, George Washington's tomb is this inscription: I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Clearly, this is again a quotation that if Washington wanted this inscribed on his tomb, this is not something that a deist would do. This is something that would come from the mouth or the pen of a Christian. So, an honest examination of George Washington's life, behavior, and words, I think, leads to the conclusion that he was a Christian. He had a diary of his prayers well, let me just quote here with regard to his beliefs with respect to the American culture. Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Certainly, he was not looking for a secular culture or society in America. Further, he says, whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles. So what's he saying? He's saying that education is wonderful and you can refine people and impart knowledge on people. And so obviously he's advocating for education, but what he's saying is, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that education alone, without religious principles infused in it, will lead to the kind of culture and society that we are aiming for here in America. Again, it's pretty clear, I think, that George Washington was a professing Christian. John Adams, who was the second president of the United States and the first to actually inhabit the White House, he was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And again, like so many other of the founding fathers, there are certain modern day scholars who have been critical of John Adams. As with Washington, the best thing for us to do is let's take a look at John Adams in his own words. Now, this is a quote from John Adams, and this quote is something that he wrote in response to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was someone who wrote quite a bit of vitriol that was anti-Christian, and this is what John Adams wrote in response. The Christian religion is, above all the religions that ever prevailed or existed in ancient or modern times, the religion of wisdom, virtue, equity, and humanity. Let the blackguard Paine say what he will. It is resignation to God. It is goodness itself to man. Again, defending Christian faith. This is not something that a deist would do. What would John Adams say about the necessary relationship between faith and our culture? Here's what he said, and I quoted at least part of this in a previous lesson. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. I've said this before in a previous lesson. Our Constitution and our form of government was created to control basically a people who were self-restrained, and that self-restraint and self-control comes much more naturally with a people that are infused with the Christian faith. Devout Christians are obviously much more likely to exercise this kind of self-restraint and self-control so that the government doesn't have to clamp down hard on the populace in order to maintain order. Adam saw this, and that's what he's saying, that this Constitution was made with the understanding that it was to govern a moral and religious people. Thomas Jefferson is probably the most interesting case. As many of you would know, he was the third president. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the exact nature of his faith and religion are obviously widely disputed, as we'll talk about in a moment. Even in his own day, there were cries of concern about him being elected as president due to the concerns about his possibly being either an atheist or a deist. Now, he did self-declare himself a Christian. So obviously he denied that he was an atheist and denied that he was a deist. He called himself a Christian. So it's probably safe to say that he was not an atheist, but it's probably just as safe to say that he was not what we would describe as an evangelical Christian. Here is what he wrote. He said, "I am a real Christian, sincerely attached to his," meaning Christ's, doctrines in preference to all others. However, he felt that the true teachings of Jesus had been corrupted by falling into the hands of what he described as the most unlettered and ignorant of men. Now, what I would say is, unfortunately, he was not privy to more recent scholarship, archaeological finds, and manuscript evidence that we have today. Today, we have discovered so many manuscripts that we can be far more comfortable that the scriptures that we have today, and particularly of the New Testament, I would say this is true of both the Old and New Testament, but particularly of the New Testament, we have so many manuscripts now, and the study of those manuscripts can lead us to have a great deal of confidence that the New Testament that we have in our hands today is not corrupted and is reliable and a valid representation of the original writings. I've taught in other lessons about how we can know that about the manuscript evidence, et cetera. I don't want to take time now, but unfortunately Jefferson was not privy to that, and that corrupted him. Although he thought that the Bible may have been corrupted, unfortunately his views were corrupted. So what did he do? Many of you may know this. He actually edited his own form of the Bible. For example, in the Gospels, he literally would cut out all of the supernatural elements. He would actually cut those words out of his New Testament. So there were no mentions of angels or heavenly pronouncements of angels. He would cut out references to miracles. But he would leave in the teachings about them, and he would leave in words from Jesus, but he would cut out the actual description of miracles themselves. He left in the crucifixion, but cut out the resurrection. Again, as kind of the supernatural elements he cut out. And so obviously he rejected Jesus as being God incarnate, God in human flesh. But he does point to the teachings of Jesus as being the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. So, what could you say? That certainly he revered Jesus, but obviously he had a different Jesus than than what evangelical Christians or biblical Bible believing Christians would hold to. So it is hard to exactly pin down what he was. He called himself a Christian. He was adamant that the state should not prefer one sect over another, but clearly showed a preference, generally speaking, to Christianity. And here's something that he wrote: Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed the conviction that these liberties are a gift of God? I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Obviously, again, this is not consistent with someone who would be a deist, and certainly not someone who would be an atheist. I would compare him to um, today, people who call themselves Christians but are kind of lukewarm about it, or some describe them as carnal Christians. Um, if you ask them the question, are they a Christian, they would say yes, and that yet there's no evidence of that in their lives. And they may deny certain supernatural elements. They may also deny miracles, deny the virgin birth, deny the resurrection, say that maybe it was a hallucination or something. So I think that there are many today, even many who are sitting in the pews of our churches, who actually are closer to kind of a Jeffersonian approach to Christianity than a biblical approach. Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the inspiration for the Federalist Papers. He is considered the personal force behind the ratification of the Constitution. He distinguished himself during the Revolutionary War and caught George Washington's attention, who appointed him the Secretary of State. He was certainly very, very involved and engaged in much of what occurred in early America and its foundation. He was not raised in a particularly devout home in terms of Christianity, but he did attend King's College. And as we saw in a previous episode, King's College was in many respects a seminary. King's College is now Columbia University. Now, Hamilton turned on Thomas Jefferson for the reason that he believed that Thomas Jefferson's faith had been unduly influenced by some of the radical elements from the French Revolution. Thomas Jefferson actually had spent 5 years in France. He left just as the French Revolution was beginning. Now, why is that important? Well, the French Revolution was very different from the American Revolution in the sense that the American Revolution had as its foundation religious freedom, had as its foundation those who wanted to freely exercise religion. And the French Revolution was not that at all. There was no religious element to it at all. Whereas obviously the early colonies, many of them were formed by people who were fleeing Europe so that they could exercise Christianity freely. That was not true, obviously, of what transpired in initiating the French Revolution. And so Hamilton, seeing what Jefferson was saying and writing and so forth, he believed that these kind of European ideas that Jefferson had been exposed to in France and apparently had at least partially embraced would corrupt America, and he wrote that. Here's something that Alexander Hamilton wrote on the Constitution. In my opinion, the present Constitution is the standard to which we are to cling. Under its banners, bona fide must we combat our political foes, rejecting all changes, but through the channel itself provided for amendments. By these general views of the subject have my reflections been guided. I now offer you the outline of the plan they have suggested. Let an association be formed to be denominated, quote, the Christian Constitutional Society. Its object to be first, the support of the Christian religion, second, the support of the United States, hand in hand. Obviously, Alexander Hamilton would have no idea, no thought that there would be this notion there should be a strict wall of separation between the church and the state in America. James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, one of the chief architects of the Constitution. Surprisingly, as you'll see in a minute, some modern day historians point to President Madison, James Madison, as a key proponent of, quote, a separation of church and state. Now, is this true? Well, the problem is historians relying on secondary sources instead of directly from the writings and words of James Madison himself. If you look at the original sources, it is clear that James Madison would not approve of many of the current notions that are being applied to him. Here's what one historian said about James Madison. After the manner of the Bereans, he seems to have searched the scriptures daily and diligently. He explored the whole history and evidences of Christianity on every side, through clouds of witnesses and champions for and against, from the fathers and schoolmen down to the infidel philosophers of the 18th century, the 1700s. No one, not a professed theologian, but few even of those who have ever gone through more laborious and extensive inquiries to arrive at the truth. So he was diligent in his study of the faith. And these are some of his words. Religion is the basis and foundation of government. Again, does this sound like someone who was proposing or would be in favor of a separation of church and state? He's saying religion is the foundation of the government. In a note in his Bible, he wrote, Christ's divinity appears by St. John chapter 10, and Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. Resurrection testified to and witnessed by the apostles, Acts 4:33. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the light of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all, obviously pointing to Christ's divinity. Clearly, this was not somebody who would be a deist, and certainly based on that first quote, he would not be in favor of separation of church and state. Now, he did strongly oppose legislation in Virginia, the state of Virginia, establishing a state religion. We've talked about this before, and that is that though the founding fathers were Christians and the states had requirements that office holders be Christian, they were very careful that they did not want to stamp a state religion as the religion that everybody had to adhere to. They wanted to make room for religious conscience, that people could exercise the faith that they chose for themselves, even if office holders were required to be Christians. And again, what you noticed in those state constitutions when we looked at them, they did not say you had to be an Episcopalian or a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist. It basically said you had to be a professing Christian. But it was left open-ended as to which particular Christian denomination you adhered to. So here's the quote from Madison. Because the policy of the bill is averse to the diffusion of the light of Christianity, the first wish of those who ought to enjoy this precious gift ought to be that it may be imparted to the whole race of mankind. He later added about the bill, it at once discourages those who are strangers to the light of truth from coming into the regions of it by being too exclusive and not opening it up to whatever denomination or sect of Christianity one might profess to believe in, or system of faith that they wanted to worship under. It was too exclusionary. And so, again, like so many others, he was in favor, obviously, of a freedom of religion, even while the state constitution could limit those who could hold office. James Madison was an evangelical Christian, and clearly he had a desire for mankind to find the truth that he had found in his diligent study. And so his opinion was that establishing a state church actually inhibited that. He wanted to make room for people to do their own uh, investigation into the faith, and whatever Christian denomination they felt the most comfortable with, or their own investigation into it was more consistent with their own thinking, that's what they should do. And so he was more concerned with state intrusion into the church than religious intrusion into the state. Again, like with so many of these, and even Jefferson himself, this idea of the wall of separation was to protect the church from the intrusion of the state. It was not to protect the state from the intrusion of religious principles, religious faith, and religious people. And so, again, this is consistent with the intentions of the other founders, including Jefferson. James Madison, again, we have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all of our political institutions, the government, upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the Ten Commandments of God. Again, this goes hand in hand with what John Adams said, and that is that our Constitution, our form of government, was established with the understanding that it was to be governing a moral and religious people. And as John Adams said, it's inadequate for any other. And so this is what James Madison is saying. We're staking the future of American civilization on the fact that this type of government, this form of government, was established to govern people who could be self-controlling and self-restrained. And of course, in their day, they were of the belief that as long as we had our Christian underpinnings as a foundation for the culture, that this Constitution would work. Now, obviously, with this particular quote, you can see on the slide, if he's saying that we staked our future on adherence, for example, to the Ten Commandments of God, would there be anybody thinking that he would believe that it would be proper for the Supreme Court of the United States to say that the Ten Commandments cannot be placed in schools or in public places? Now, just like Jefferson, another of the founding fathers who is a bit controversial in this sense is Benjamin Franklin. Certainly very well renowned. Since I'm here in suburban Philadelphia, obviously Benjamin Franklin is a very well-known figure and character here in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. He was a printer, a writer, inventor, a scientist, and a philosopher. He was actually the governor of Pennsylvania and a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. At the time, he was 81 years old. He's the only man to sign all four of our founding documents. And of course, that includes the Constitution and includes the Declaration of Independence, as well as others. Now, as to his faith, there is certainly no evidence that he ever became a professing Christian, but he did have a long-standing respect for the faith, and there are reports that he became a close friend of the evangelist George Whitefield, and he said Franklin said in his writings that he loved listening to George Whitefield preach. Here's what Franklin said about his own religious proclivities. I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshiped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is in doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental points in all sound religion. So certainly Benjamin Franklin was not an atheist. He was not a secular humanist, as some might contend. I suppose I would compare him to those today that you hear, whether it be athletes or entertainers or people in a public setting, or who, the man on the street interview, and they refer to, quote, the man upstairs. They obviously don't have a defined, they don't have a biblical faith. They have some kind of generic belief in a higher power. But clearly they are not of the Christian faith. And in looking at this quote by Benjamin Franklin, he says that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. I fear for the soul of Benjamin Franklin, because God is a God of justice. And the truth of the matter, again, me being a Bible-believing Christian, is we don't want justice, we want grace. And that grace comes through Jesus Christ only. So our founding fathers were religious men who created a form of government based on Christian principles, and I've spoken over and over about that. Clearly, they wanted to avoid a situation where a national church was established, because so many, particularly the colonists, had fled that, and they saw the oppression that actually comes from that in Europe in particular. At the same time, they knew and expressed in their words and writings that religious faith was a prerequisite to the success of this experiment in self-governance here in America, and that faith that needed to be the foundation was clearly Christian. If you listen to what they said and read what they wrote. Sadly, their original intentions have been watered down, ignored, and even changed or denied, resulting in what we now see in these battles over the supposed separation of church and state. I believe the notion of a separation of church and state that is espoused today is something that would be completely foreign to our founding fathers, and they would be aghast, really, at how far we have drifted from those Christian underpinnings of this nation. And they warned us repeatedly that the form of government they were establishing was basically created with the understanding that the populace would be self-restrained and self-controlled. And of course, their understanding was that required that the populace be at least predominantly Christian. So I hope this series has been interesting and informative and maybe thought-provoking as well. And hopefully maybe set the record straight with respect to our founding and what the true meaning of the separation of church and state was originally, and how far it differs from what is being proposed and acted on in our legislators and courts today. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you've seen all the videos in this series, and maybe you'll do some of your own research and look further and more deeply into the subject, particularly as we celebrate America's 250th birthday. God bless you.